Good morning, and welcome to the Autogas Answers webinar, sponsored by the Houston-Galveston Clean Cities Coalition and the Propane Council of Texas. My name is Andrew DeCandis. I'm one of the co-coordinators of the Houston-Galveston Clean Cities Coalition. And in addition to the other guests on this webinar, you'll get the chance to meet our other co-coordinator, Ben Finley, later on during this program. In case you're unfamiliar with Clean Cities, I wanted to start with a very short background about the program. Clean Cities is a network of coalitions sponsored by the Department of Energy that work in communities across the country to advocate for and implement alternative fuels, fuel-saving technologies and practices, and other new mobility choices. And we work with partners to develop events like these, as well as to hold stakeholder meetings and work to inform our stakeholders about opportunities such as grant availability, through our newsletter and other outreach. And when it comes to the promotion of alternative fuels, we're fuel neutral, meaning that we are interested in promoting any alternative fuel that can reduce reliance on traditional fuels and can help improve air quality in our region. And propane is one of those fuels. And as such, we're proud to host this webinar this morning. So we'll start off today with Steve Whaley, the Director of Autogas Business for the Propane Education and Research Council. Then we'll hear from Brian Green, Vice President of Green's Blue Flame Gas Company. And then we'll hear from Heather Ball, the Grants Advisor at the Propane Council of Texas, to talk about funding opportunities that are out there. And finally, we'll follow it all up with a Q&A driven by you. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Steve Whaley.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I see that Julianne has given me control, so I'll see about advancing some slides here. And there we go. Don't see the option of turning my video back on, Julianne. The three little dots up there in the corner seem to have disappeared for that. So we'll just go on with how we're doing. Before we get started, Andrew did a great job of making sure that everybody understands that Clean Cities is fuel agnostic, and the whole idea of replacing the king of the hill, which is gasoline and diesel now, with an alternative, and there are lots of choices in that. So before we dive down into propane, I'd like to give just a little bit of an idea of what a successful alternative energy adoption looks like. It has to have certain criteria for it to be able to displace that king of the hill, if you will. So with that, let's take a look at this next slide here of what makes that alternative energy adoption successful. And so there we go. And now you can actually watch my hands moving around while I'm talking, because I do that quite a bit. But for anything, whether it's biodiesel or CNG or LNG or propane or electric, hydrogen, any of those alternatives have to meet these criteria. Let me go back one here. I think it seems to be going a little bit. Well, Julianne, I'm missing just a little bit of this control of the slides, and maybe you might have to help me out here. I thought I had it.
It just moved. Did your slide move on your screen?
Yeah, but I'm actually trying to go back there. That's where I wanted to be. So these four criteria for any of the energy sources that you're trying to use for transportation have to be met. So the first one is, if it's not cleaner than what we're using today, it's not going to work. So it has to reduce emissions, and it has to do it at a significant amount and without adding cost to it. The second criteria is the whole cost of using this energy source with the upfit of the vehicle to be able to handle it, and the infrastructure to be able to deliver it to that vehicle. All of that cost has to be less than what we're using now with gasoline and diesel, because if it's not, you're really not going to get full adoption into it, because as Heather's going to talk about with funding opportunities, those kind of things kind of help along and stimulate the adoption or the start of it, but you can't underwrite with funding the adoption, the continued sustainability of energy, and any energy source that's not going to end up being less. The third one is we can't compromise on performance. That performance of horsepower, of torque, and of range as well can't be compromised based on what we're doing with gasoline and diesel. And then the last one is kind of going without saying, we have to have a lot of this energy source available to take on that 60 billion gallons of diesel that's in the mid-duty truck market today. So we have to have a lot of energy to be able to make that happen. So with those four criteria listed, how does propane, which we're talking about today, fit into that equation? Well, we have the most cost-effective emission reductions of anything. We're going to talk about that a little bit today. We have the lowest total cost of ownership of any fuel, including gasoline and diesel. And we have the exact same horsepower and torque, maybe a little bit more in some cases. And we're able to put enough fuel, because propane is a very high energy source, and because it's a liquid, it stays in our fuel tank at a lot of energy for a very small footprint, and we'll demonstrate that a little bit here too. And then the last one is my favorite. We have a lot of it. we have more propane in these United States than all the other countries combined. As a matter of fact, we used 9 billion gallons here domestically, but we exported nearly 20 billion gallons last year. And so my job is to change that equation and actually flip it on its head and use more of it here domestically than we export. And you're going to help me with that, because everybody on the call today is going to see the great value that propane provides, and do more fleet vehicle adoptions. And we're going to bring that equation upside down and keep more here and use more of it here than we actually send out. So what is this propane? We use the term Autogas quite a bit, actually, in the title of the program today, Autogas Answers. But Autogas is the term that we use for propane when we're putting it in a vehicle and moving it down the road, whether it's a car or a truck or any kind of over-the-road vehicle. We use the term Autogas, and we actually borrowed that from the Europeans. They have millions and millions. As a matter of fact, propane Autogas is the third most used vehicle fuel on the planet, next to gasoline and diesel. But it's exactly the same propane that you put out on your back deck in a grill that lets it heat and touch your food. It's that clean, but we use it in millions of households. For heating and on agricultural farms, in forklifts. Matter of fact, in forklifts, long before the EPA was regulating any of the emissions, decades and decades and decades ago, forklifts, they learned quite early on that when you operate a forklift inside a warehouse with gasoline or diesel, it's not very healthy for people. As a matter of fact, too much carbon monoxide and you die. But when you operated on propane, it was very healthy. And so now the whole world is our warehouse, and so we're cleaning up all of it. So where does propane come from? We have two sources, and we're going to talk about both of them today. The organic source, as it comes from the ground, as well as renewable sources, more of the man-made kind. And we'll talk about the benefits of that renewable portion as well. But the important part at this point is to note that they're exactly the same in molecular structure, and they're both non-toxic. Both of them, you can't spill it, you can't contaminate the air or soil or any water sources. And so it makes it for a very, very low risk to have that kind of fuel, unlike gasoline and diesel tanks that eventually have some kind of leakage and seepage, and the cleanup on the older tanks is very, very expensive. So these are the things that we're going to cover today, as far as why fleets choose propane, that lowest total cost of ownership, and we're all going to be talking about that: lower emissions, reduced noise, less maintenance, all of these things. And one of my favorite is actually the employee morale, driver retention. Sometimes people kind of look at it with a jaundiced eye on anything new, but I'm going to drive a school bus on propane, or hey, I'm going to drive my delivery truck on propane. They kind of turn their head up a little bit, but once they actually start driving it, there's no turning back. When they're fueling, they don't get that diesel smell all over their clothes, and they actually can hear, school bus drivers can hear what's going on the bus because it's so much quieter than a diesel. So drivers actually prefer them very, very much over the others. So along with any energy source, we have to have a path to zero emissions. And so what has propane's path to zero emissions been looking like? Well, because when we first started off with this, the particulate matter was the one we were going after. The emissions particulate matter is virtually zero when we have propane. But the second one we tackled was the nitrogen oxides, the NOx emissions. We got to with most of ours now at either a low NOx or an ultra low NOx. And so they're certified 90% cleaner than the emission standards for EPA and CARB. But what we have with a study that was done by the same group, West Virginia University, that busted Volkswagen for their NOx emission scandal. So these folks kind of know what they're doing. Well, they put two exact same buses, one diesel and one propane, and it was the best in class clean diesel, and it was the best in class clean propane. And they put their local emission measurement equipment on both of these buses that were on the same route. And for several months they drove through, and what they found with the on-road emission comparison was 96% cleaner on propane than it was on diesel. So it was an astounding amount of reduction. Now, the third thing we're working on now is actually the greenhouse gas emissions, not just from the tailpipe, but for the whole life cycle of the vehicle. And we'll talk about that at the very end of what we're going to cover. But I'm going to talk a little bit about fuel, because that's Brian's portion of this session here, but more on the maintenance cost reductions when we're operating fleets on propane. Just to say that the blue line here, where propane, we're always less than gasoline and diesel. And some of the prices for propane around the country are reflected here. Very stable, but the real cost savings is actually in the vehicle maintenance. None of the diesel exhaust fluid systems have to be on these vehicles, so we're saving money there. And these are all those components that have been added to a diesel engine to be able to meet those EPA and CARB emission standards. Now, there's another big round of lowering in 2024 for those vehicles, and another one in 2027. And so this equipment actually is going to grow and get very much more expensive, but none of this exists on a propane powered vehicle. So we don't have to pay extra for that. And we're already meeting the 2027 regulatory emissions today with the vehicles that we're putting out on the market. Just to give you an idea, those engine components for that diesel engine are about $20,000 more. And so when it comes to a preventative maintenance, for most of our propane engines that are more like the gasoline type engines, we have, in a Ford, V10, that 6.8 liter that's commonly used in the school buses, it's only 7 quarts of oil, and it's a $4.50 filter compared to, nearly 20 or more quarts of oil and about a $45 filter. So every single time you do a preventative maintenance just with an oil change, you're saving a couple $100 per vehicle. So what can we do this on? What vehicles can we have running on propane? Well, there's a lot of them. Law enforcement, first responders, delivery vehicles, service trucks. One of the most popular ones, though, are actually the school buses. This for me, 15 years ago, this was a really unlikely source for me. I did not pick this one as a winner, so I was surprised. But because of the emission reductions, because of it being more quiet, because it's the safest vehicle out there, school buses have really taken off. And actually, in all three major OEMs of school buses, they all offer propane options. And they're deployed, the darker the blue here, the more propane buses we have there. In Texas, you're doing very well. Congratulations. I think there's over 3,000 of them there in Texas. But nationwide, we have earlier this year crested the 20,000 school buses operating on propane mark. So when all the schools are open, we're able to move, 1.25 million students to and from school every day. But one of the important parts here is how many folks have actually adopted. We have over 1,000 school districts, as well as a lot of the school contractors that have adopted propane into their fleets. And once they do, they don't stop. They have very good success with that, and they increase those. And one of the reasons why is it's so cost effective. I'm going to pick on Bluebird here for a second, because they offer all four options for a Type C school bus, exactly the same, equipped bus, but if it's running on diesel, about that 98.5 mark, propane is just a little bit more, less than 10, about 10% more. CNG is about 35% more. But then when you get into that same bus with an electric power, we're getting into some serious money here. Even with funding opportunities, this is a pretty hard pill to swallow when you're trying to operate an entire fleet. And the same thing goes with the Volkswagen settlement funds. You can see here from the amount of money that's been awarded, the blue area, and the number of buses deployed in the yellow area. And we have a very right side up equation. We can put a lot of buses on the road and do a lot of emission reductions with a smaller amount of money. I pulled this out because I just wanted to brag on you folks in Texas. This was a study recently. It came out October 27th, I believe, and it compared two states, Texas and California. And Andrew's comment about that, all of the above, fuel agnostic, but whatever works, the best in a particular vehicle platform that reduces the most emissions and displaces the most amount of gasoline and diesel wins. And Texas has had a posture of an all of the above, where California has a much more narrow view of basically it has to be electric. And with that funding, you can see the $816 million that has gone into funding, over the road projects in California has produced 35,000 tons of NOx reductions, whereas Texas spent a whole lot less, that 561 million, but produced a whole lot more NOx reductions, almost twice as much as what California did over this 15-year study. So this is just an add a person kind of slide there for showing how well Texas is doing. So what are the next school bus success stories? School buses has led out, and right now we have more adoption and continuing in school buses than any other market. But we have three other markets that are coming up fast on that kind of success that school buses have had, and basically for the same reasons. It's in that medium duty class 3 through 7, which has a whole lot of fuel usage because these vehicles weigh a little bit more and they usually go a little bit farther. The regional routes, not just the last mile or the first mile, but the ones that have to go, down the road and around the bend on longer routes, is a sweet spot for propane because, like I said earlier, we can carry a lot of energy in a very small space on a vehicle. So what are those three? Well, the food and beverage delivery is one of them. This has really taken on. Schwann's Home Delivery, I think most people are familiar with that. There's over 4,000 Schwann vehicles that are operating on propane now. Another one is Nestle Waters. They started with 5 water delivery trucks about 5 years ago, and now they have over 1,000 of them all over the country, delivering all that water with a very clean energy source, propane power. Another market is the paratransit, the shuttle buses and the high capacity vans. There's, the American with Disabilities Act requires every county to be able to provide this kind of transportation, and they're also used in airports for, airport parking. They're used in universities all over, moving students around. But these paratransit, shuttle buses, they average 600 gallons of fuel per month nationwide. And just to give you a little comparison, that's about twice what a school bus uses. So you get a much faster return on investment, even though it's only a very small amount to go up to using propane. And there's quite a few of these vehicles nationwide in that E350, E450 kind of cutaway all the way up to the 550s and sometimes 650s for the extended passenger vehicles in the paratransit industry. The other is the parcel and package delivery. I think we're all familiar with UPS and FedEx, and UPS has a very large deployment, over 1,000 of their package cars that are running on propane, and FedEx Ground, especially the independent contractors that are doing that, find the benefit of using a much less expensive fuel. But a new one that's come out the last year is the United States Postal Service. I don't know if you know this or not, but there's 92,000 routes that the United States Postal Service is responsible for, but they pass on the responsibility of 70,000 of those routes to independent contractors to move the mail from distribution center to distribution center and hub to hub. Not that first or last mile going to your home or business, but the ones that are moving the mail in between those distribution centers is done by independent contractors. They have 2 types of trucks: tractor trailers with a 53-foot trailer, but then there's about 10,000 of these 26-foot box trucks that are moving. And I know you've seen them going up and down the road. Usually the U.S. mail sign on it is rather faded because a lot of these trucks are very old. But these have started using propane this last year, and now it's catching on very much. The interesting thing about this is these trucks run 6.5 days a week, day and night, and they run through about 1,000 gallons of fuel a month. So it doesn't take very long at all to realize some very substantial savings. Now, everybody has a cost calculator to input, and put in, based on maintenance, based on fuel costs, based on this. We can project into the future the kind of savings that you'll have. Well, there hasn't been too much work done on a forensic historical analysis of, okay, what has it done in the past? So PERC, the organization that I'm with, we've embarked on doing several of these studies, and one of them I'll show in a Class 7 truck that's pictured here. These are both the same model year, 2015 Freightliners. One of them is an M2 with a diesel engine, and one of them is a S2G with a propane engine. And over the last 5 years, we analyzed every single maintenance record. We analyzed every single a gallon of fuel that had to go into both of them, and calculated exactly how many miles both of them had gone over the last 5 years. And so we have a maintenance cost per mile on propane of 25 cents. The diesel maintenance cost was 37 cents. That diesel emission equipment, the exhaust equipment, is very expensive to maintain. So we have that disparity. And then we have the fuel cost savings of each one of them here, 39 cents compared to the 54 cents. But when you combine those together, you're saving 29 cents a mile in comparing these two vehicles that are owned by the same fleet in the same area, serviced by the same people and doing the same work. And so you can see from a 5-year portion how much they can save. These are some of the providers that we have that produce solutions for vehicles running on propane. Roush is one of them. They take care of all of Ford's trucks, mid-duty trucks and school buses. Freightliner Custom Chassis is another. They have an 8.8 liter drive force engine for these class 6 and 7 trucks that can be configured, for any kind of service work or delivery. Greencraft out in California is one of the 3 ultra low NOx CARB certified engines. Agility in Salisbury, North Carolina has the 8.0 liter certification. PSI does that 8.8 liter that we saw just in that other Freightliner Custom Chassis, and they just announced their 0.02 ultra low NOx CARB certification, EPA and CARB certification. That just came out a few weeks ago. Alliance Autogas is an aftermarket solution provider. So if you have gasoline powered vehicles in these platforms listed here, you can actually convert them over to running onto propane. Along with ICOM is an aftermarket that does the same thing for these chassis and vehicle model years. The thing that you want to be sure of is make sure that there's an EPA or CARB certification for the make model year that you're actually wanting to convert over. Campbell Parnell is focused strictly on the Isuzu platform, and one of their biggest customers is LKQ. It's the largest seller of repurposed automobile parts, and there's thousands of vehicles now that are being converted over to propane. The Autogas infrastructure, Brian's going to take care of this. I just wanted to show you that you can have a dispenser that just kind of clicks off gallons. They're all moving at about 10 to 13 gallons a minute, or you can have fuel management systems on these dispensers, all the way up to a full retail outlet that you have at the bottom of the exit ramp for Interstate 94 in Minnesota. That alt fuel corridor, the M to M, the Michigan to Minnesota one, and this was one that Motor Week actually had an episode on just a few weeks ago at this particular place. That infrastructure had one change this past year. As of January 1st, 2020, the new regulations have the quick connect nozzle. So this is a nozzle that you click on and you squeeze it and you click it off, and there's no topping off and trying to, it automatically stops, and it makes it really easy and convenient for those to refuel without wearing gloves or eye protection in that. Just to give you an idea of the infrastructure cost, if you wanted to set up, 10 shuttle buses or 10 trucks, diesel that you already have on your own premise for fueling, there wouldn't be any additional cost. But to go to propane, the equipment would be about $40,000 if you wanted all the bells and whistles on the fuel management systems there. CNG for the overnight time fill is going to be a couple $100,000, and even a little bit more for the electric. But the CNG and the electric are going to be more fixed. The propane is very scalable. You can have that same dispenser fueling up vehicles and just put a larger tank behind it, and you can do a larger fleet of vehicles. Brian will get into that and cover it a little bit more. So what's on the horizon? We just finished a project demonstrating propane's super technology advancements when you have Cummins build a dedicated propane engine. PERC funded this particular project with Cummins over the last few years, and we've just been able to come out and announce this demonstration engine and what it can do. It has a very high compression ratio, 12 to 1, on this 6.7 liter block that's really popular for Cummins, but everything else on it is purpose built to maximize the benefits of propane. And what we're able to do with this has been astounding. For the first time, propane has actually done better than diesel. You can see all the different engines down here and their torque and horsepower curves, but here's diesel, this black line here. This is on the first responder vehicles and fire trucks and so forth. So it's the best that diesel can do with horsepower and torque. Well, when we purpose built this propane engine, where you see the green line here is where propane is, and it beat diesel all the way around. We have 375 horsepower at 880 foot-pounds of torque out of this propane-powered engine. It has been astounding. And it also, because of the efficiencies of this engine and how well it performs, we've been able to have substantial greenhouse gas emissions from the tailpipe as well. So this leads us into what's changing on the fuel side. We have a lot of propane, just like we said before, but moving into renewable propane gets us a little bit closer to reaching those carbon reduction goals. You remember about 10 years ago, there were just a few states that were introducing legislation on carbon reduction goals. And now, fast forward 10 years, we have a lot more states that have legislated carbon reduction goals. And so let's take a look at what renewable propane brings to the table. It's a very low carbon intensity, and we'll show that here. It comes from really inexpensive feedstocks. We have a lot of it. But I think the most important part of any of these is the low energy conversion. If you have to use a whole lot of energy in the process of making your renewable fuel, it doesn't make sense. And as I'll talk about here in just a second, the amount of energy used to make renewable propane is actually a byproduct of renewable diesel. So it's kind of a freebie. So let's look at the greenhouse gas life cycle analysis here of propane as well as renewable propane. And basically the standard today is electricity. We have a baseline now that says, electricity is the cleanest fuel out there for use. So we're going to use that as a baseline of comparison. So let's take a look at the electric grid here real quick. We have fossil fuels contributing to the electric grid per state in this particular graph. You can look at Wyoming up here still has a lot of coal. 84% of their grid is actually run on coal. And you can see some of the other states that are like that. We have natural gas in a lot of states that are contributing to their electric grid. A little bit of petroleum out here in Hawaii, but biomass hasn't made a whole lot into that electric grid so far. So let's look at some renewable sources that are going into the grid. The electric ones here, in my home state of South Carolina, we have about 50% of our electric grid that's on nuclear, which has a very low carbon intensity. Hydro up in the Pacific Northwest is really effective. We have a little bit of geothermal, tiny bit of solar, and a little bit of wind through the Midwestern states here that are contributing to that grid. So let's take a look at the carbon intensity of propane compared to the electric grid of all 50 states. As you can see on the left hand of the slide, we have a carbon intensity for propane anywhere from 79 to 83. Okay. Now, if you look at these states, you can see that even in Texas, there's a carbon intensity for the electric grid there at 178. So already propane is cleaner with greenhouse gases of a carbon intensity than the electric grid is here. So let's actually take a case study of an electric truck, much like those postal service trucks that are operating 200 miles a day. And we'll do the same on propane and the same one being charged off of the electric grid. Okay, so if we're just using regular propane compared to the electric grid, this is actually the number of tons of CO2 either reduced by the electric grid or reduced by propane. And in 38 states, propane in its current state right now is this much cleaner on life cycle analysis of greenhouse gas tons per vehicle. So a 1-to-1 ratio of vehicle to vehicle. And we can look in Texas, and if you take that mid-duty electric vehicle compared to the propane that's going in that same vehicle over a 1-year time period, there's 169 tons of CO2 less with propane than there would be from that electric grid. So let's move into renewable propane. And this renewable propane is now substantially cleaner than the electric grid, and almost every, except for Vermont, that gets its electric grid from Canada's hydro source, is still a little bit cleaner than renewable propane. But when we start going into renewable propane made from DME, which has a carbon intensity of minus 278, we get even further. So we do a blend of renewable propane with renewable DME, and all of a sudden we are better than the electric grid in all 50 states, and by a substantial amount. Well, Steve, that's not fair, because the electric grid is getting cleaner. Okay, so let's give the electric grid its 2035 goals. And those goals are all met with renewable energy sources. We're going to give them a 5,000 cycle battery. So it has 1,000,000 miles on it. And we're going to compare our best case blend of renewable propane with the best case scenario of the electric grid. And even then, propane has a lower CO2 emissions than those. So to wrap all this up, the benefits of propane and renewable propane is very cost effective. You'd be hard pressed to find any propane vehicle conversion or upfit that's going to be more than 15% of the total cost of that vehicle. Whereas when you look at other sources, it's substantially more to run it on another source. We don't have to give up the payload. You can see a little schematic there of a cutaway of an E450, and the fuel tank is about the same size, and we don't have that extra heavy weight that's going to take away from the payload. And of course, we've just reviewed the greenhouse gases. All of this and a whole lot more information is at propane.com, and I'm looking forward to answering the questions. Andrew, I'll go ahead and let you introduce our next speaker. Thank you.
Well, thanks. So our next speaker is Brian Green. He's Vice President of Green's Blue Flame Gas here in Houston, and they're one of our biggest providers of, if not the biggest provider of propane here in our region. So I'll go ahead and turn it right on over to Brian.
Thanks, Andrew. So starting off, one thing that I want to do is speak as a Autogas user, before an Autogas provider. And so these trucks you see in the picture, the two on the left were our last two diesel bobtails that we changed over to propane bobtails in, I believe, September, October of last year. And these propane bobtails save us 60% on propane over the cost of diesel, 60% of our fuel costs by running propane instead of diesel. Now, it's a little easier for a propane company to do that in terms of, the cost is the cost to get the gas here and not get it to a separate fleet location. And, the infrastructure is already in place, but most of the time, the same benefits and the same, I guess, hurdles into running Autogas are the same. And so, even today, most of our users, are saving around $1 compared to gasoline, not diesel to gasoline. So, and that's why people do this. This is Clean Cities meeting, right? So we all have that in mind. But if it's not cheaper, if you can't get a return on your investment on the equipment that you're investing in, nobody is going to want to do it. So as the slide changes, I'll speak a little bit about our fleet.
And I think if you use your directional arrows, it should advance the slides.
Yeah, all right, let's see.
And if not, I can always move them for you.
Still looks like it's not going through. Okay. Did you do that or did I do that?
I did that. So go ahead
Okay.
and just cue me when you're ready to switch slides and we'll take it from there.
Sounds good. Okay, so starting off, and why our fleet is a good example is because it's a very diverse fleet. So starting off with the bobtails that we spoke about a little bit, Class 7, the Freightliner S2G is what we run the most of. And these bobtails are really a good application the way we use them here in the Houston area because we make 20 to 30 stops a day. They're usually in the same area. So the truck runs out to an area and it's stop and start. They're running a PTO to run the pumps. So it's a lot of stop and go traffic, things like that. The engines never get up to a high temperature where a diesel engine would be more efficient. And it really makes these propane good applications for that. So, similar to like a school bus or a paratransit where it's a lot of stop and start, always running an air conditioner, things like that. And then we have several different types. We're pretty much moving all over the S2G just because we like it, the application for what we do. Our service trucks are, the Ford F550 we have as crane trucks. And these are an Alliance Autogas conversion, which is a vapor conversion. We use mostly Alliance Autogas because we've been a member since 2010, I believe. So where our application is for those we keep them. We've also installed a lot of ICOM systems, which is a liquid propane system on some of our customers. We also have a Ford F350, which is a mechanic's truck. It runs around, repairs vehicles, stuff like that when they get down. We have an Isuzu NPR that's converted as well, that delivers propane racks and cylinders to forklift applications. And then even on the light duty side, we have a Ford F-150 service manager truck where, he can run out to jobs and take tools and things like that. And our sales representative has a Ford Taurus, which also has been converted to propane with an Alliance Autogas system. So very, very, wide range in terms of fleet, what class of vehicle you can run propane on. And if you don't mind going to the next slide. So just a little bit about, our history in Autogas as a fleet. We adopted pretty early on, early in the 1970s. And so the truck at the top, that's my grandfather who founded the company with my grandmother. So that was I believe a 75. And so as soon as that, we were already running on propane. And down in the 90s, we supplied not only our own fleet, but several other fleets here in the Houston area. Down on the bottom left, you see that picture of the propane truck fueling some vans. We were pretty involved with that. We kind of learned that, servicing your own fleet and your customers' fleets kind of go hand in hand. In the early, 2000s, we were kind of forced to take a step back and go into diesel, at least on the bobtail applications, because there was a gap in the technology for the fuel injection. So the stuff that was coming out of the new vehicles, propane conversions hadn't caught up to that technology yet. And then back into the 2010s, we started transition back into propane, and and along the lines, we just really kept a running on propane mentality. When you have that, hey, we know we're getting the benefit, and we're going to jump these hurdles and make sure it works. We've also had a service manager for 40 years who's been working on these vehicles, since this time. So that's helped us out a lot. We're committed to moving forward with that and having other service managers, mechanics take that on as well, not just for our customers' fleet, but for our own fleet. Next slide. So, and Steve talked a little bit about this, but in terms of starting up an Autogas program, there's really two things. There's the cost to convert, or the differential cost between the propane and diesel or gasoline. And then there's the actual cost of the infrastructure. And so, for a conversion upfit costs, you're generally looking, $6,000 to $8,000, depending on the vehicle, depending on how many you get converted at one time. And, as far as the infrastructure costs go, most of our customers actually don't buy the equipment. I think this is one thing that, a lot of people, when they're looking at fleet managers, when they're looking at getting into propane, they don't realize is you can lease the equipment, which gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of, if you lease your property, you need to move. If it's going to be a temporary solution and maybe do a longer term solution down the road, that this is a very viable option. Our customers would pay a margin on the gallons to pay for it while still getting the savings they would need, and not like a monthly or yearly lease like that. And so what the customer, what we are responsible for in these situations, and the propane company would supply the tank and this dispensing system, and the customer or end user would supply basically any permanent structure that goes into the property, like foundations, concrete pads, crash protection, electrical, depending on the city, the permitting costs that would go into it. And so, really, when you're looking at just those few things, the customer's cost up front can be, around, we typically see $5,000 to $30,000. And it's usually depending on if they're located within the city limits or not. And one thing that you really have to think about in running these is, in making this transition, is your total ROI. So if you've got, a vehicle and you keep for 10 years, if your return is 3-4 years, you're going to get a lot of savings off of that. So keeping that long-term business-minded outlook on those investments. Also, incentives, funding, and grants are huge. In that first picture, I won't speak too much on this because Heather, that's the meat of her section. But that in that picture, she actually helped us get the natural gas. It's the TERP natural gas incentive grant, and we were able to get about $60,000 to get rid of those 2 diesel trucks and move on to propane. And it's dependent on several things, the difference between how dirty the engine was versus how clean the new one's going to be, how many miles you run, and that sort of thing that I'm sure she'll go into more details. But it really made a significant impact on what we had to pay up front to make that change. And some other ways to do this is you can get creative. We do have a landscape customer, and so basically what he does is every time he goes to purchase a new set of fleet vehicles or even mowers, is he just rolls the cost of the conversion into the financing, knowing he's going to get a return back on it. Some other things that you could do is you can actually pay with your savings. In other words, you'd pay a little bit more cost per gallon for the propane, and the cost of your conversion would be rolled into that. Next slide. So in this picture, the idea here is just to show the main components of an Autogas refueling system. And they come in many shapes and many sizes. So this would be more of a simple solution where you've got maybe a 10, 20 vehicle fleet, and setting infrastructure for that. So the first main part is the tank. Generally, tank, from storage, you can have anywhere from 1,000 gallons to a lot of school districts will put in either an 18,000 bulk storage or a 30,000 bulk storage. The reason for that is because they're using enough and they want to get the savings of having that fuel coming straight from the plant, basically, and not having to go through a supplier, put on a smaller truck and get in. There's quite a bit of savings in doing that. Another thing is, people sometimes get concerned with propane because they say, well, even if they've got on-site diesel and gasoline, well, propane's not the same. You can't just go to any other gas station and grab some propane like you can gasoline and diesel. So The supply for propane is fairly simple. If you're in this Houston, southeast Texas area, your propane is coming from Mont Belvieu, which happens to be the largest hub for propane in the country. And as far as monitoring the supply, most companies now use tank monitors or telemetry to monitor the level of propane in that tank. So whenever it gets to a certain level, your propane supplier gets a notification that, hey, we need to go in and fill that tank to make sure, our customers' fleet stays up. So lots of advancements in technology have been able to make it a lot easier to ensure constant supply for Autogas customers. As far as the other components on here, the dispenser, I'll talk about a little bit more in the next slide, but there's a wide variety of options and things you can do here. If you want just simple, just get me up and running on propane, or if you want card access to monitor the miles and all that information. The the pump is also usually a pretty simple component. For a standard small fleet, it'd be a 240 volt pump and 3-phase. These can go. You can get a lot more powerful pump though if you're looking to supply a very large fleet. And like Steve said, you're usually looking to at least 10 gallons per minute on these. So really no different, and sometimes even faster than you would have at a gasoline pump. All right, and like I said before, from the customer standpoint, end user, the biggest things are the site prep. If you're in the city limits, they do require a concrete pad. You got to have the correct power supply and bollards to go around this to ensure that everything's safe. Next slide. On the dispensers, like I said, you've got the simple push to start, which it has to be locked in a different way. You've got card access, which can be opened. This can be for either a fleet or even a public location where you have a card. Somebody has to have training before they're able to use it. One of our the train dispenser in particular even would show a video to ensure people have been trained prior to letting them fuel. So there are cellular-based communication. You can customize the data management for the information that you want, and this is all typical for what large fleets would have for gasoline and diesel. And you can accommodate even multiple fleets at a single location using the card access. As far as options, you can have a single or dual hose set up. It's installed as a package, so there's not anything else that has to be added to it. And you can add these dispensers and pipe them in, as your fleet grows, should that happen. One thing that's not in here specifically that I'll talk about is the nozzles, because that's really very important. Most people are familiar with the Acme nozzle, where if you go get a cylinder filled up somewhere, like a forklift cylinder, or if it's an older propane vehicle, it's a screw-on type connection. And it's, historically wasn't really the easiest to work with. And if there's any school districts listening, you probably know what I'm talking about. But within the last 5 or so years, what's became really popular is what mostly is referred to as the Eurofill nozzle. And it basically replicates the process of filling a vehicle, like either gasoline or diesel as much as possible, but having to take into account that this is a closed fueling system. So basically it's a stab-on connector where you stab it on, you close the valve with your hand, and once it's closed, it's sealed and it starts pumping. And then you just release that handle to let go and it comes off. So there's no need to deal with the Acme threads and misthreading and having damage to equipment, that type of thing. It's a much easier mechanism for fueling vehicles with propane. Next slide. Another one of the hurdles, I guess, in terms of propane, and this goes for if you're a propane marketer supplier, or if you're school district, or a fleet of delivery vehicles, is how do you, how do you either get these converted and how do you support the maintenance of these vehicles? And so the biggest thing here is the conversion systems are much easier to install and maintain than they used to be. I mean, even as, 5-6 years ago, we would get a conversion system and it would come and it would just be a bunch of wires that would have to be all, connected by hand, each one individually. And nowadays you get a harness where you unplug components and you plug these in. So, if you have, mechanics available, if you have a fleet manager, this is something that those people can be trained to do if you have a large fleet and want to do it yourself. And the thing is really on this, there's no one solution that's going to be the same for every fleet. So you have a case like my last mission where you have mechanics on staff. They can perform the maintenance. Most equipment providers with the conversion systems, they'll let you come to them, or sometimes they'll even come to you to perform the conversion training, the maintenance training, that type of thing. Some companies use their propane supplier as their conversion and maintenance shop, if you will. We've been doing that for a while, and we like doing that. When our customer has a problem and they know they can come to us, bring it to our shop and get it fixed. If it's propane, or if it's not, have it diagnosed as not propane and get it to a dealer or another mechanic. A lot of companies use the dealerships where they purchase the vehicle, especially if it is an upfit. So it would come from a Bluebird or something like that. And having that relationship with them is key in terms of the communication and getting that done. And a lot of times, people also will find a local shop that they are familiar with that maybe works on their fleet vehicles that are not propane, and then helping them get the training to be able to support the propane vehicles in their fleet as well. Next slide. So I'm just going to give here a couple of example fleets that we service. And so this first one is a hospital network in the Texas Medical Center, and they, are replacing diesel with propane. And so their fleet consists of 20 propane-only buses. So basically, they're exactly the same as a school bus, just maybe upfitted a little differently on the inside. And they also have 9 paratransit shuttles that we converted using an ICOM system when they purchased. So basically, they had them shipped into Houston and brought them to us, and we went through them to get them running on propane. So this particular example of an infrastructure for refueling is 2,000 gallons, 2 1,000-gallon tanks. They do have the tank monitors on there that lets us know, hey, when they're getting low. And it's a private dispenser, and for even the amount of shuttles they have, for total vehicles around 30, they're still using one dispenser. The way they operate allows that. They don't bring all the shuttles in one day at one time of day and have everybody run it. The drivers do it themselves. And so this is a really good paratransit examples. They use this for both employees and patients getting from parking lot to the hospital or within hospitals inside of that hospital network and medical center. Next slide. This second example is and something that Steve mentioned in his presentation as well, is an airport park and ride service. These are also really good applications for propane due to the vehicle size, the amount of miles they run per year, the amount of gallons they consume. They get an ROI pretty quickly on the conversion cost. And so they, when we first got in contact with them, they were using they're using CNG and diesel, and they're required to run half their fleet on alternative fuel due to being located inside and operating inside of the airport network. And so they were looking at different options for other than CNG. And so they started by converting it. They would get 2 to 3 shuttles a year, convert into propane, and then kind of follow it, see how it works. And they've been really, really happy. And as over time, they're starting to slowly work in more propane into their fleet. As far as their particular infrastructure, it's not on site. So we've got a fueling station at the airport, at Bush Airport, and it's what is referred to generally as a public-private fueling station. In other words, it's locked. You have to have a card access, or in this case, a key to get into the dispenser. And so, it monitors the same things: the unit number, miles, gallons, and in this particular example, they were actually able to get a cost savings over natural gas as well. Next slide. Just a couple more quick examples. Sometimes, our customers have a space constraint into where they're not able to put in a horizontal tank. And so this one on the left is a private dispenser with a 1,200 gallon vertical storage. And so this was supplying a fleet of about, I think at the largest of the time was maybe 40 to 45 package delivery and package handling vans. The one on the right is an example of something that would be a temporary solution. So it's a 2,000 gallon tank, one just kind of a dummy dispenser, as we call it, and then it's got some traffic barriers around. This was in place before we received final permitting to put in the actual bollards and concrete and things like that. So one thing that as much companies don't realize, and I've seen this a lot with school districts, is when we're going into propane first, it's kind of hard, right? Because for them, they want that big 18 or 30,000 gallon tank, and they can't do it right away. Well, one of these temporary solutions is something to consider, rather than having a propane truck come in and fill each bus individually. In terms of time savings and having access, this could work very well. Next slide. And so you see the fueling for propane and maintaining that constant supply is really fairly simple and straightforward, and kind of all based on who you build a relationship with and who you use in wherever your area is. And so if you have any questions about anything on these slides that I talked about, feel free to give me a call or reach out by email, or if you just have any general questions about propane in general, looking into what you would need to do to kind of start that process within your own organization, I'm happy to help.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Brian. And we'll move on. Next, we'll hear from Heather Ball, and she's the grants advisor with the Propane Council of Texas. Heather, please feel free.
Thanks so much. I think Julianne has to load up the slides, but while she's doing that, there we are. Great. As was mentioned by Andrew, I am a grants advisor for the Propane Council of Texas, and I'm really here to help any of you who are fleets find the best grants to assist you in transitioning to ultra low emission vehicles in order to help your bottom line and clean up the air that we all breathe. And just this year, I've helped public entities, private companies with vehicle needs from heavy duty haulers to light duty vehicles. And so there's a myriad of incentive programs out there. They have different deadlines, different requirements, and I'm here to sort of help you find the best one for your application. And so, please contact me. I'll look through what you've got in your fleet that might be eligible for various grants. And you may not know that a certain one is, or you may think the requirements are too onerous. And some of them are really easy. So that's what I'm here to do, is just kind of sort through all the underbrush and find that grant that's going to work for you. Or if you don't have one that's going to work right now, kind of put you in my little Rolodex, and when a grant comes available that I think might work for you, I'll get back in touch with you and see if we can't make that work then. And then I really want you to feel confident when you go to your board of directors, your city council, your school board, whomever your governing body is, that you've identified the best grant match, and you have all the answers to the questions that they might have about transitioning to propane. So I'm here to kind of be that one-stop backup for you to really shine and be the hero in terms of saving money and cleaning up the air. Next slide. So right now we're going to be talking about incentives for propane vehicles. Next slide. And my message to you is, don't wait. You know, I know with budget situations and time constraints, you might think, oh, I want to do it, but I don't want to do it right now. Or your finance officer may be telling you, why don't we just wait on this? And my message to you is that a lot of the deadlines are coming up in January and February. And so if you don't apply now, you're going to miss it. It is possible that they'll come back around in another year or so, but that's up to the Texas legislature in most cases, and it doesn't meet till January. It is facing a budget constraint, so we don't know if they're going to be funded or at what level they'll be funded. And it'll be a different funding mechanism. So everything's kind of fruit basket upset right now in terms of what levels and what programs are going to be funded. Let me just share a little story with you. In 2010, I was in charge of recruiting school districts for a Department of Energy grant program that I was operating. And you know, I reached out to a bunch of them, some of the finance directors, you know, because the revenue situation was pretty iffy in 2010, they were reluctant to commit any funds. But those transportation directors that did apply, 2 years later, when the funding finally came through and they were purchasing the vehicles, they were heroes. I mean, they had, you know, their grants paid for up to 50% of the cost of their vehicles and their refueling infrastructure. So we don't know how long this recession revenue situation is going to last, but don't wait to apply. Remember, you'll have a year and a half after you're awarded the funds and are authorized to make the purchase. So if we do come back to transporting our students or you know, filling up our hotels, you'll want to be ready to pull the trigger right then, and rather than having to wait another year and a half to go through the process. Next slide. Okay, the good news is in 2019, the Texas legislature finally agreed to start spending some money out of the $2+ billion in the Texas Emissions Reduction Plan, the fund balance that had just been sitting there kind of balancing the state budget. The proposed budget for 2022 doesn't identify how much of that trust fund would go to grants or what those grants will fund. So again, that's that uncertainty situation. And that's why, if you can, I would really encourage you to go ahead and apply for what we know is out there now. Remember, you will have a year and a half to actually spend the monies. And if you decide not to go forward, or if the legislature in its wisdom should come up with a more generous program, we'll just switch you over. That's exactly what I did for entities that applied for monies under the emissions reduction plan. And then the Volkswagen came through and it was more attractive. We just took those grants and switched them over. So that's a possibility. And I will always be monitoring and making sure that you're getting the best grant. And if another one comes up that's even better, I'll just help you transition over to that one. There are several groups, including the Texas Propane Gas Association, Clean Air Working Group, and the Natural Gas Vehicle Council. They're already in discussions regarding programs and budget amounts. So, weigh in on that as well. Brian, of course, this is particularly aimed at you. But with the bad news is, with the current revenue situation, the money from this trust fund could be redirected to fill holes in the budget. So we'll have an updated budget forecast. The comptroller came out with a preliminary one saying the revenue situation doesn't look as dire as it did. But we need, as an industry, to get our oar in and make sure that those funds that were dedicated for alternative fuel vehicle grants and infrastructure actually get funded for those. Next slide. Okay, so the holidays are approaching. I know you're sort of going, how can I add this to my plate? In fact, I was just communicating with a fleet manager today and sort of like, this is important. And I don't need very much to help you get started. As Brian mentioned, Green's Blue Flame was somebody I helped last year. Just send me some basic documents, and I'll tell you which ones they are if you reach out to me, and then I can determine what your grant amount, at least give you a very good estimate of what your grant amount would be. Most of these do require replacement, so you want to have your oldest vehicles, your dirtiest vehicles be first on the list. But with that grant amount, then you can go to your finance director, to your board of directors, and tell them, okay, given this, I want to apply now. And again, remind them they have 1.5 years to actually make the decision of whether they're going to get the replacement or not. So the deadlines that are coming up, January 7th is the light duty vehicle. There's lots of money in that, and it does not require replacement. So if you are looking at pickup trucks or vans, anything under 10,000 gross vehicle weight, this is a really good program, and it's been virtually untouched this year. So for propane pickups, propane vans, this is a really, really good option. The 27th is the Volkswagen settlement deadline. That's a very attractive program. If you're a city or public entity that provides refuse hauling services or street sweepers, anything like that, this is a really generous program, and I would encourage you to look at it. And then February 26th is the deadline for the natural gas vehicle grant program. And despite its name, it does include propane. And that's the one that Green's Blue Flame and a number of other both public and private entities have taken advantage of. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the various programs that are available. Andrew, I'm going to turn it over to Ben right now to talk a little bit about the Houston-Galveston Area Council programs.
Thanks, Heather. First, I want to talk about the AirCo, the Area Emission Reduction Credit Organization. This was legislated into existence by the state to help keep track of the buying, selling, and trading of air emission credits throughout Texas. It also issues the Supplemental Environmental Program Funds, which we refer to as SEP funds. Replacing vehicles and equipment with propane-powered vehicles or equipment will usually be an eligible project for SEP funding. However, our SEP funding is currently very low. Lately, SEP funds are being sporadically issued by TCEQ, and there are other similar organizations that are popping up in our region that are also competing for SEP funds as they are released through TCEQ. Moving on to the HJC Clean Vehicle Program. Like all clean vehicle programs throughout the nation, we have been stymied by the Buy America First executive order. Without receiving waivers, this program can no longer provide funding for vehicle replacements. However, not all is lost. HGAC staff is in the process of redeveloping this program in order to pivot from purchasing vehicle replacements to leasing vehicle replacements. We believe that applying a leasing option will allow entities with larger fleets the opportunity to establish an alternative fueled pilot project in case these organizations want to experiment with alternative fuel vehicles. We anticipating launching this initiative in February of 2021. Just because I see some ISD fleet managers in the webcast, this leasing option will be also available for leasing buses as well. There are links on the main HGAC website should you wish to follow AirCo and Clean Vehicles. That website is h-gac.com, all one word. Thank you, Heather.
Okay, well, thank you. And as Ben mentioned, these SEP funds, they are the most generous and the easiest program, but they are very limited and very sporadic. But again, I'm here to help you guys find the best one. And if we start down a process with one grant program and then an SEP comes available, and Ben and I communicate about this fairly regularly, then I'll shift you over to that one. Because again, I want you guys to be heroes to your finance directors and your board of governors, whoever it is you report to, that you have chosen the best program. Real quick, we talked about the upcoming deadlines. The first one is the light duty vehicle grant program. Again, the easiest program to apply for. $5,000 for a new light duty natural gas or propane vehicle and $2,500 for electric vehicles. And I'll help you fill out the application form. It's simple, and you have no follow-up requirements. You're not required to report on the vehicle for the next 4 years or do anything like that. So great program if you're in the market for new propane pickups. Julianne, next. The Volkswagen grant, again, if you're in the market for like a propane street sweeper, or if you have the smaller refuse vehicles, for public entities, this is a great program, and I really encourage you to look at that. And just give me a shout. I'll help you fill out this one. This one is a replacement program. You do have to have an older one in the same gross vehicle weight in order to replace it. Next. The Natural Gas Vehicle Grant Program, this is great. This is generally your go-to program if you're looking at replacing older diesel or gasoline vehicles with propane. And again, the heavier the vehicles, usually in that 26,000 to 33,000 is about the sweet spot in terms of the grant amounts. But if you'll get in touch with me, I'll get a couple of documents from you, your gross vehicle weight of the old engine or old vehicle and the engine make and model year. I can give you a pretty accurate grant estimate of what you could be receiving on that. Next slide. This one is kind of interesting. Again, it's mostly for public entities, but it's going to be open in the spring. The regulations haven't been written on this, but it is definitely available for propane vehicles. And when you see liquefied petroleum gas, that's what is LPG or propane in common parlance. So again, get in touch with us, and I know Ben and Andrew will also do a great job of blasting out to everybody when this one comes open and what it's going to contain. Interestingly, it is going to have infrastructure. So those of you who maybe we're listening closely to Brian's presentation and think, I might like to have some on-site infrastructure, it is possible that this one will cover funding for the infrastructure as well. Next slide. There's an updated grant chart on our website, and I keep it pretty well updated. Andrew and Ben with HGAC have a very similar grant chart. I just keep on mind just the grant programs that are currently open, so that you can go there, see if there's money left, and what, just a brief summary of what the requirements are, and do you need to destroy the old vehicle, who's eligible, things like that. And that's at txng.org. But you will get that in our contacts. Next. So recently, I had a school district that was going propane, and they had questions from their board members. How much does refueling cost? What's the price of natural gas and propane? How much does it cost to retrofit a bay? All of those kind of questions. I can help you with that. Again, you are going to look like the smartest kid on the block when you give your presentation to your governing body. And I'm going to be reaching out, of course, to Brian and Steve Whaley and to HGAC for the answers to some of these questions. But I can sort of be your accumulator as far as what the answers are, and we'll turn it around real fast for you. So when you have to give a board presentation, we will get you the answers that you need. That is kind of it, and thank you so much for your time.
All right, that's fantastic. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate that. And now is the time for the Q&A. If you, as was mentioned before, if you do have a question, please put it in the Q&A section, and I can go ahead and turn on my camera. I can go ahead and set and ask your question, and we can work to get an answer. And we do have one question in the chat, and here it is. Is there a point in the future where the electric grid will match propane in greenhouse gas life cycle emissions? So I'm thinking that's for Steve.
Sure, I'll take that one, since I kind of threw that one in the pond. With renewable propane, we have that now. We know the carbon intensity. We know what it takes. There's two major sources today. REG in Louisiana gets about 5 million gallons of renewable propane that is trucked to different places, and most of it's in California and Oregon, where low carbon fuel standard credits are valuable. But you have a carbon intensity add as you travel with a diesel powered large transport truck moving it. But all of those factors combined still make propane, like for example, in Texas, 169 tons of CO2 less than the electric grid. Now, as the electric grid gets better, and the projection I put in there was basically the best case scenario for the electric grid of 2035. If the goals are met of 95% of the grid source being renewable, which is kind of, I mean, it's out there. I mean, that's giving it all, but it also includes that battery source of about 5 times more capacity than it is today, and it doesn't account for any carbon in the manufacturing of that battery. I left that part of it out. So even with the best case electric grid and the best case of renewable propane, we're still 44 tons of CO2 less than that electric grid of the future, and that's with what we can do today with renewable propane. Who knows what we're going to be able to do with renewable propane in 15, 20, 30 years from now. Does that help answer it?
I think so. I think that gets the point, but if not, please feel free, Victor, to post more in the chat. But we do have a second question about where do all of you, see propane fitting in a foretold shift towards a global hydrogen society? definitely there is, we certainly have started to see sort of, and this is something I can speak from experience here in Houston is you know, we've worked for a long time to try to develop hydrogen here in the Houston region, and we had a very difficult time not so long ago, just going back 3-4 years ago. But recently, through a project that we've been doing with our counterparts in Dallas, as well as discussions that we've had, there definitely does seem to be some movement and some growth in hydrogen. And so Steve, or
I'd be
Brian,
glad to, yeah, I'd be glad to tackle that one first, and you guys can jump in. I personally, I love hydrogen. I mean, when you have water as an emission, I mean, that's always a really, really good thing. And on the vehicle technology side of it, I really like it. But the biggest obstacle with hydrogen is moving it and storing it and you know, putting it into a vehicle. You know, I've worked with propane, but I've also worked with compressed natural gas quite a bit, and it's still in that same kind of infrastructure, moving it and getting it into the vehicle as being the most cost prohibitive portion of it. If we could find a way of alleviating the moving of it and the dispensing of it into a vehicle, we'd have a whole lot more success with hydrogen. I mean, if you look at what happened in Germany with hydrogen, you can see the kind of a little bit of the progression of that and where it is today. If propane being, you know, I mean, we're at 100 psi, you know, tank pressure on a 60-degree day outside. So, you know, when Brian is putting this, you know, from a bobtail into a dispenser, we're moving this just like a liquid, you know, for gasoline and diesel, but with just a very little bit of pressure. Even when it gets to be super hot down in Texas, you know, at 100 degrees, we're still at, you know, about 212 psi, which, you know, isn't much more than what your pneumatic tools are in your shop. So it's just a whole lot easier to move, store, and dispense it into a vehicle with a cost that's going to, you know, match one of the criteria that we talked about at the very beginning, and that is it has to be less expensive than gasoline and diesel. And that's for the whole cycle, not just the commodity price of the fuel, but for being able to move it, transport it, and get it into another vehicle.
I guess the only thing that I really have to add to that is, you know, people like to get excited about technology, whether, you know, in this case, we're talking about hydrogen, we're talking about electric, it's cool, you know, but in certain applications, and especially, you know, more on the medium duty and larger truck, like when you're talking about electric, is there's still a ways to go before you have a totally reliable solution in these cases. Where with propane, you've got a totally reliable solution now. Maybe it doesn't have all the frills that some of these, you know, emerging technologies have.
yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it dovetails really well with something that Steve said earlier, that, you know, we're really sort of moving into an all of the above future. And I had a conversation a while back with someone from DOE, not related to the Clean Cities program, you know, but somebody who works with a lot of grants for alternative fuels. And you know, I asked him, well, what do you think that the future looks like? You know, do you think that there's going to be, you know, what do you think the fuel of the future is? And his response was, well, all of the above, because everything has, you know, and if you look at all of them, everything that we have, CNG, electric, propane, hydrogen, they all have pluses and minuses, and they all have, you know, you can start to see where maybe a niche develops, where something might work really well for one fuel, but work really poorly for another. And I think that's, unfortunately, that means the future is complicated, but I think that there's a place for everything here, and I think I think that's part of what we're doing here, you know, at events like this and through our work with Clean Cities, is trying to, you know, help people understand, help people find the best course, plot the best course for their future and for their work, and move forward with that knowledge, with some sort of understanding that they can make the best of it with whatever they choose, whether it be propane or something else. And that's why I think this has been a great event for that to talk about it and hear all of you talk about what is out there.
It's interesting, Andrew, the DOE and their funding of technology development, this past year awarded propane projects over $9 million in technology advancement projects, which shows their interest in pursuing, this fossil fuel. And I say that on purpose because although natural gas and propane are fossil fuels, not all fossil fuels are created equal. And there are some very dirty ones like wood and oil and coal and such. And then you have some very clean ones with natural gas and propane. And to put them all in the same category isn't the best. But DOE sees a bright future for propane.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think we have one more question for Heather for your contact information. Could you read out your contact information?
Well, I could, but aren't you going to send this out to everybody that attended?
We do the video as well as information. So so why don't I do that? We can send that out later.
Okay, I think it's going to be easier for people to click on, but it's Heather at txng.org if somebody needs it right now.
Okay, that's great. And then we'll send out more complete information later on.
And
Okay,
Julianne can splash that contact screen up there again too, I think. Ta-da.
There we go.
There it is.
Look at you.
All right, great. So we are past 10:30 now. So if there's no other questions, I think that we should probably move towards an end. But I wanted to say thank you all very much. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, Brian, and thank you, Heather. And thanks to the folks at the Propane Council of Texas for making this possible. And thank you, Ben, my co-coordinator. I think that we have this has been a great presentation, and I appreciate all of